And it was a crazy environment, I guess, for a 15-year-old to fly into, where you've got, because it was all ages, so I was part of a youth program, but I'd be put into a dormitory initially with 7 other guys, and half of them were coming off methamphetamine, or some had been sort of drinking for 30 years. My name's Aaron, born on the Gold Coast, Queensland, to 2 Kiwi parents in the early 80s. My parents had migrated to Australia a few years earlier, before my birth. They were Christian at the time, so my mother was saved in her teenage years. My father was led to the Lord at university with Mum. He had been walking with the Lord a few years before he got married in the early 20s. I was born, my sister Grace was born after that. They basically broke up when I was about 2.5 years of age. Mum at the time took us to New Zealand on a holiday and didn't return, stayed with her parents. So there was a bit of a court battle at the time in New Zealand upon the return of Mum to New Zealand with us. Dad sort of pressed for her to be returned with us to Australia under the Hague Convention, which basically says that kids can't be removed from a country without the agreement of both parents. That kind of dragged on for a while, and Dad ultimately was unsuccessful in the courts, due to what he's told me is due to a lack of money. So things with her father were very rocky in terms of there being a lot of abuse for her as a child growing up, sort of significant abuse. So she had sort of had to go back into that context of living with her parents again, and her father, which was, I can imagine, was very difficult at the time. Was very challenging in terms of her mental health. She had a lot of postnatal depression. Suddenly being a single mother, living on a government benefit. Due to, I guess, that childhood trauma with her dad, we had to leave my grandparents' home and sort of move into a rental. We sort of jumped around different rentals quite a lot, moving to where we could for sort of short periods of time. Housing was unstable, things were very difficult financially, and very difficult, not only, for a young mum with struggling with mental health, but also with 2 young kids that are missing their father. My behaviour was challenging as well. As a sort of a young, between sort of the ages of 2 to 5, just missing my dad, things like that. So Mum at the time, one of the options available to her was to send me to what's called a children's health camp. So these were quite big in New Zealand, sort of post-war, where we would, where kids could be sent there to mainly sort of the lower socioeconomic kids, or kids that have maybe had some state intervention, child protection involvement, things like that. You'd be sent off to these health camps where you're basically kind of living in a boarding house where you've got sort of, my earliest recollection is sort of 40 beds in a dormitory where you're just sort of sleeping side by side with kids, and it's sort of staffed by staff sort of coming on different shifts, things like that, and it was very regimented. And I guess trying to, you'd go to school on site too, have sort of free meals a day. Pretty traumatic, very challenging as a 5-year-old to sort of, not only have I kind of been ripped away from Dad in Australia, and then we've been sort of moving house to house and very unstable and dealing with Mum's mental health, but also suddenly I'm living in this basically felt like an orphanage, away from family for a number of months, and then sort of being reintroduced back into the family home at the end of that, and sort of, with sort of agreements around my behaviour at the age of 5 that I'd be sort of behaving better. It was quite obviously a pretty heavy-handed intervention, and I think now sort of reflecting on it I can see, you know, Mum had a very difficult relationship with her own father, and then obviously, you know, and then had a marriage breakup with my dad, and also suffered some trauma and assault, had an assault as a teenage girl herself from a man. So there was sort of that, I guess, a bit of an sort of an anti-male focus sort of permeating the household. So I can see how that could very easily be projected onto a young child of my gender that was acting up at the time. So things were still difficult, very difficult. We had some support from the church where people sort of came together and sort of helped us to purchase a low value home, sort of went guarantor on a mortgage and supported us to buy a house, which provided a bit of stability, which was fantastic. It was, you know, it definitely needed a lot of work, the home. I remember sort of one of the rooms was basically sort of locked off for a couple of years. We just wouldn't be able to go into it because it had just been trashed so badly by the previous tenants, sort of having dogs and things living in there. We would, it was a difficult time, but I'd say during that time we also would see the hand of God moving as within the home. Like we'd often be praying, you know, Mum, even though she was struggling with mental health and, you know, sometimes wouldn't be able to get out of bed, things like that, it was still very much an atmosphere of faith, and we'd be praying about things, you know, praying for food, or if there's things happening at school, we'd be praying about that. And I'd often see sort of God intervening and answering these prayers, you know, directly, you know, about stuff at school. We'd sort of be praying about things. If I had a conflict at school with someone, and, you know, we'd see God. I remember one particular moment where I sort of had a conflict with a kid at school who had kind of was very distressing for me, and kind of you know, I'd lost quite a few friends over it, and then just sort of supernaturally we kind of there was a peace brought to that situation, apologies said, and it was all sort of restored. And other times we'd just have food parcels brought to the house, things like that, and support brought. So I'd be sort of praying and reading the Bible as a kid and learning about Christianity, which was fantastic, and we'd be going to different churches as well, so that was great. And then I think around the age of 9 or 10 I actually was sent back to the health camp again, so that was another sort of traumatic period where I've gone back.
And what was the reasoning for that, for going back again?
I think behaviour. Like, it was just a single mum struggling with the behaviours of a 9-year-old, and that was sort of seen as the intervention. There wasn't really any men around, so there was no sort of father figures or even extended family, because we'd kind of been cut off and away from the grandparents, sort of my grandmother there, sort of helping us, but there was no wider extended family networks to help intervene and provide support to the family. So I guess she was sort of going for a state type intervention again, which again, really traumatic, very difficult. Another thing about the area we were growing up in was actually, it was called Poverty Bay, so, of New Zealand, so it's a bit of a crazy name. The neighbouring area is actually called the Bay of Plenty, so I was quite into cricket as a kid, so sometimes I'd represent Poverty Bay and actually be wearing the hat Poverty Bay, and we'd be playing our neighbour's Bay of Plenty. So there's sort of that air of difficulty in the area too. Like, it was very much a struggling part of New Zealand, probably the least prosperous, most the highest rate of people on welfare. Just sort of growing up, having a job of any sort was seen as being a success. There was no real talk of any type of sort of higher education or what a job outlook might look like later in life. I think I can only sort of remember sort of my late teens sort of hearing about university for the first time and what an actual pathway to that might look like, or a TAFE education or whatever that might be. It was just that was typical to the area. It's probably about the age of 12 I decided I actually really feel like I really want to connect with Dad more. Like this, it just wasn't kind of working out for me in Poverty Bay, and Dad was still in Australia. I'd had some holidays with him throughout my childhood, like I might have a couple of weeks visiting him on the Gold Coast, or Dad coming to New Zealand to visit us. So I went over to move over with him sort of at the start of high school, and so he was in a new marriage at this point and had a stepson from the new marriage and two daughters from the marriage as well. We were all enrolled in a private Christian school, so things were very different on the Gold Coast. He had a business, it was very successful at the time. It was noticeable to come from, it was a very stark contrast to go from Poverty Bay to suddenly I'm on the Gold Coast. And there's a lot of money around, there's a lot of money just in general on the Gold Coast. It seemed like a very prosperous place, Suddenly we're going to a private Christian school. Things felt a lot better there in a sense, an opportunity for me to try to connect with Dad. But sadly, basically sort of as shortly after my arrival, Dad sort of started going through a bankruptcy. Things started going downhill with the business, and he almost lost everything really with the business. Had to sell multiple homes, and we had to move into another home as a family. Not probably 6 months, 12 months after my arrival. So it was all pretty crazy and traumatic at the time, I guess. Where I've come out of that in Poverty Bay, and suddenly I'm trying to connect with Dad, and then we're going through this. So he wasn't really obviously going through that. He didn't really have the time to spend with me as he's responding to this crisis. So I think at the time it was we were very much sort of, me and my stepbrother were kind of left to our own devices, similar age, we get along very well, and we kind of just decided to, probably were able to move more into things that we wanted to without any boundaries in place at the time. So when we sort of started to hang out at the local skate park a bit on weekends and had the opportunity to try marijuana and drinking, things like that, we started to do that and started to sort of talk about it at school and get other people involved, and it sort of became a bigger and bigger thing. It went from enjoyable, you could say, in the early days, to suddenly I was sort of felt a lot more of a depression sort of beginning to sort of come over me, and it ended up that 9 of us were actually expelled that year from school. So that was, again, probably about sort of 12 months after my arrival in Australia. So 9 kids expelled from this private Christian school due to drug taking and partying on the weekends and bringing the school into disrepute. I think somebody sort of threatened to go to the media about it within the school, and they didn't want the name to be tarnished in any way. So it was a big hit to me at the time, and I felt the depression at that time very much begin to take hold more and more. Suddenly I didn't have school to go to. Dad's business is failing, then suddenly Dad's marriage is sort of on the brink as well, and that began to break down. So Dad and me moved out of the family home to like a little apartment as they separated. This is sort of around the same time. I just remember Dad would started driving limos, sort of just to bring an income in during this time. So he'd be out at all hours just driving limos, and I was just sort of left alone in this small apartment, not going to school. I was I'd kind of got a job to sort of tick a box. By the time I'm about the age of 14, got a job sort of telemarketing and 3 hours in the evenings on the Gold Coast with a friend, and that sort of ticked the box, so I was actually doing something. It was very depressing. I sort of went further and further into depression, sort of smoking more and more marijuana to try to get out of it, to make me feel better, but not really understanding that it's actually making it worse at the time. So very much sort of self-medicating with that, and kind of went on, and then I enrolled in another school the following year after sort of 4 months off, and then I just sort of immediately went into the wrong crowd at that school too, with more smoking and marijuana, not really attending school at all, and then that sort of fell by the wayside. And I just remember just feeling very, very depressed. There was no one to really talk to about it. I sort of would try to reach out to Dad about it and didn't really get a response. I don't think there was much understanding of mental health back then at all. Dad wasn't really walking with the Lord either at the time, so he'd sort of left the Christian faith, was a Christian probably, really sort of a name only. He was sort of, I guess, with his being newly divorced as well, he was trying to find connections out in the community too, so he'd be partying a lot more, he'd be sort of out. So I got to the point, Mum came for a holiday when I was sort of about 15 years of age, and I decided to go back to New Zealand again. So I flew back with her back to Poverty Bay, and I got a job at a local supermarket, and again just sort of thinking that might help the situation, but I just kept on smoking more and more marijuana, drinking a lot more, connected in with sort of a friendship group that was doing that, and I guess I definitely noticed that it was different for what seemed to be for the friendship group, where it was more around having a good time. I felt like I was just sort of trying to push down emotions. I felt like I'd just trying to numb the sadness really that I was feeling, and it kind of went on for about a year, and I kind of got to the point where I started to think of suicide as an option. Maybe this could be a way out. Just sort of the darkness kind of seemed to increase more and more. It just seemed like there was literally no sort of way out of my predicament. Like I tried to go back to connect with Dad, I tried to go to the Gold Coast, things are broken down there. There was no pathway forward. I was working at a supermarket just pushing milk and butter, which just to get enough money to buy drugs for the week and alcohol, things like that, which in turn was just used to self-medicate myself. So it just sort of as a spiral, sort of vortex downwards. And I started, to contemplate suicide. Whether
at what sort of age were you starting?
15. Yeah, 15. And and I sort of started thinking of plans, thinking of ways to end it. I think one of the things that sort of held me off was the belief that there was a spiritual realm, and that God was real, and that there was a reality of heaven, there was a reality of hell, and where would I go if I did actually kill myself? Yeah, that kind of was a stopping point for me, I think, from doing anything for quite a long period of time. But it did reach a point where I just remember one night just feeling incredibly down, just really in sort of a dark place and just a broken place, and just sort of crying out to God, where I just felt like God just saying, God, you'll either intervene or I feel like I have to end it, and I just remember calling out the name Jesus, and I remember just sort of a peace just sort of coming over me, and a a joy in that moment, and not an audible voice, but just a like a voice that just said, it's okay, I love you, and I've got a way out of this for you. And I remember just taking that word and not really doing anything with it in the natural, but just knowing, wow, that's amazing. I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder how can God help me out of this. And then within about a month, I was connected in with a really good drug and alcohol counsellor. I'd been loosely connected with a hospital just due to some medication that I've been taking, antidepressant medication. Somebody had referred me onto this great drug and alcohol counsellor who got me a referral to a rehabilitation centre in the South Island of New Zealand, which I was able to go within like a month's time of that encounter with God. Yeah, so I flew down there and stayed down there for like 3 months, and it was a crazy environment, I guess, for a 15-year-old to fly into, where you've got, because it was all ages, so I was part of a youth program, but I'd be put into a dormitory initially with 7 other guys, and half of them were coming off methamphetamine, or some had been drinking for 30 years or more, and shaking and having some really severe withdrawals. So very confronting, and being confronted to go into these group sessions of 40 people in a room, and we're all kind of like an AA type situation, or Narcotics Anonymous, where we're sharing our stories and talking about things, and every day was kind of had a very strict structure to it of what we're doing to help ourselves and get support with the different addictions everybody had. But I can remember just being in a room full of probably 50 people one night, and just beginning to share my story about what had happened and what had been going on in my life, and just remember crying, and it just came out, just sobbing uncontrollably for probably 10 or 15 minutes, and just the rejection, I think, of childhood, rejection from both my parents, the rejection of not having anyone there, the darkness of having to use substances to make me feel better, to make me feel okay, and just the desperation of my situation as 15 in a rehab. And it was very powerful just to be able to share and talk, and then I'd connect in with a group of Christians at the rehab, and we'd go down we had what we called a spiritual garden, so we'd go down with a guitar, and people would just start worshipping, and we'd be singing, and people would pray, and we were encouraged at the rehab to connect with a higher power. So I would, some people would connect, would found a new faith in nature, or were worshipping trees, or some were Hare Krishnas. There's all sorts of different faiths, and I very much started praying and reading the Bible again and connecting with God, and I basically just gave my life back to Jesus within my room at the rehab alone, and then started growing in the faith from there, connecting with these people in the spiritual garden, started reading the Bible, and quite a rapid change. I feel like God had a lot of grace for me. There was a real infilling of His Spirit in my life, like a lot of the darkness lifted. There was a lot of renewing of my mind with the scriptures, and and a lot of a real sense that I really had a real sense that God was helping me. Like, I couldn't deny that the fact that I'd got to rehab was through Him. So I think that it gave me a real confidence that things were, to have the Creator of the world kind of in your corner, helping me directly. That really, it felt like to be honest, felt like I had a father for the first time in my life. So I'd gone from being fatherless to suddenly having a father. And then
And when you say that,
Yeah.
what makes you say that about having a father? Can you give an example of how you felt fathered in that time?
I think the fact I could go to a place, the prayer closet, or go to a place of prayer in a state of brokenness, where I'm sort of don't really have any idea what's going on or where I sort of fit in the world. It's sort of such a sense of being lost, really, and so many different emotions coming up, so many different thoughts and feelings, but I can take that and to be filled, to have the Holy Spirit come and comfort me in a tangible way, where I've sort of, 5 minutes earlier I am feeling totally distressed, and suddenly I've got a peace that surpasses all understanding. I don't know where it can only be a peace from God. That it's basically like a child being comforted by a father. And now that I am a father, I can sort of see that now. If I've got a 5-year-old child crying and distressed, doesn't understand the context, that's essentially where I sort of was. And you've got, sort of a bit like God wrapping his arms around me, and that was a fatherly sense. And then I'm suddenly, when you're reading the Word, I'm getting into the Bible and reading, studying, there's a sense of you're being directed like a father would direct a child, where, suddenly there's a path that I can actually follow. There's a context for the world that I'm living in that made no sense suddenly. Yeah, so I guess that's sort of a sense of the fatherness of the father heart of God coming through there. And then I came out of the rehab. I got connected into a church. It was Pentecostal, and because of the region we were living in, Poverty Bay, it was sort of a 50-50 split of, you had 50% Maori and then 50% white population. There was sort of no other real nationalities around at all. So I'd grown up probably very much sort of just had a groups of white friends at school. We'd have our friends who were Maori and connect with them, but I'd never sort of hung around or spent much time within the Maori culture. But I joined a church that was 90% Maori and Pacific Islander, and a really thriving, awesome church, great pastor who'd also gone through a similar life to what I had, but probably 100 times worse in terms of being in, bikies, gangs, had lots of tattoos, had been in drugs and alcohol, and then found the Lord and was now the pastor of a church. And there was lots of people in the church with those types of stories where their lives have been kind of turned around and connected with God. And it was I found it was a great culture to be, not only the church itself, but also the people in the Maori culture was such a great culture for me to come into, because it was so communal. Lots of food and hanging out, lots of laughs, a lot of growth within the Christian faith. It felt like I was sort of part of a tribe in a sense, like we were really powering forward and doing a lot. Like a lot of people were coming to Christ at the church, and it was an awesome experience. I had a very strong kapa haka group, which is sort of a cultural group where people do the haka and different performances, and that would be sent out to different events and things as well, and it would give the opportunity for people to share their testimonies at these events, and for the gospel to be preached. So that was really good, and it was also a really great time for me to be around other strong men of God who I was able to really kind of feed off a lot and learn a lot of different things about what it looked like to be a man, really, and what true biblical manhood looks like, as people, laying down their lives for their families, families that were growing together in Christ, things like that, stuff that I hadn't really been exposed to, I guess. Seeing a community come around if somebody was struggling, if children were struggling, rather than, where someone would be sent off to a health camp or something like that. Suddenly there was a wider community to come and support that family. So a lot of great stuff really, but I was able to really rebuild, grow in, and then eventually head off to university at another town in New Zealand, Palmerston North, where I was sort of let in under a special arrangement for people that hadn't gone through high school. So I sort of arrived at university actually having no schooling since the age of 14, which was, I think they don't do that anymore. It was just a special time where somehow they let me in. And I didn't even know how to write an essay at the time. And I remember sort of submitting my first piece of work and being called into a lecturer's office and then explained, this is how you write an essay, this is how you structure it. And I was able to resubmit it and just sort of pass with a C, and then I sort of built up, and with support of friends at university, church at university too. So very much God working in me throughout that time, continuing my personal relationship with Him, but also the community coming around me and just sort of lifting me and guiding me through that. Yeah.
You were still in New Zealand?
Yeah.
And then once you finished your studies, what happened after that, and how did God continue to move in your life after throughout your study and after you finished studying?
So I finished my studies in social work, and then moved into the realm of working in child protection. So in hindsight, it was probably a good fit in terms of what I'd been going through in my childhood. And I enjoyed a lot of the work. Obviously it was really intense, and I had some friends in Australia and Melbourne. A lot of people in New Zealand, once you finish university, they'll go overseas. Like it's quite a very common thing in New Zealand for people to at least go over for 2 or 3 years to somewhere else just to explore the world a bit. So I came to Melbourne. I had some friends here and joined Bridge Church at the time, and continued to work in child protection, and was able to meet my wife at Bridge Church shortly after arriving there. She had actually just come to the Lord herself as a new Christian. Yeah, I actually met her at a New Christians event. I thought it was a Welcome to the Church event, but it was actually for new Christians, so I pretended I was a new Christian for a while, and then revealed who I really was. And then and we had our engagement there, and we stayed at that church for almost 10 years and made a lot of good friends there, and really were able to both, I think, grow a lot individually and as a couple as well within that environment. We were able to then become parents and then grow through that experience too. Both of us coming from broken homes, sort of unlearning a lot of the things that we'd learnt as children and what we'd seen growing up in. I think both of our parents have had 2 marriage breakdowns each, at the least. I think my dad's had 3 now. And just sort of learning to learning to allow God to heal us and to grow in our marriage and help us to be the best parents that we can be, and definitely don't always get it right, but living in that lifestyle of grace and faith, it's been amazing to be, and probably something I never thought I'd actually would be able to have accomplished would be to be married for 15 years. Like, I feel like it's quite incredible even to think of that number at the moment. Yeah.
So Aaron, thanks for sharing your testimony with us today. What for people who might be for say younger people, or even talking to your younger self, who might be going through similar problems with, as you say, not having a father figure, what advice would you give them, or what would you say to them?
I'd say yes, seek out God, seek out that personal relationship with Jesus, one-on-one and really cry out to him, because he will always answer. He's always there for you, and I'd say try to seek out a community of believers where you can come together and experience God in that corporate setting too, and then also being able to build relationships with healthy male role models and connections and friendships that can have a huge impact and help undo a lot of the damage that you may have had from a father just being absent, or an abusive father, or whatever the case might be. It's amazing how God can work through just one connection, one friendship, one relationship with someone. Just know that His grace is always sufficient, and His power is made perfect in our weakness.